Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph and we are continuing to learn Hilchos Tzitzis. We'll be learning today in Yirtzeh Hashem Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis. We begin a brand new and a somewhat complex siman. And the truth is we've been finding that a lot of these simanim here in Chelik Aleph, they deal with things that we're very familiar with, and yet you see the tremendous complexity of halacha, even on things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, and we think we know what we need to know. Yet you see the tremendous complexity that there is in all of these halachos. So here we are in Yud Zayin Amud Beis, Shulchan Aruch Siman Yud, Dine Kanfais Hatalos, the halachos that pertain to the corners of the four-cornered garment of a talis cotton, Uba Yud Beis Seifim, and here we have 12 Seifim. Says the Mechaber Sif Aleph, talis she'ein la arba kanfais petura. A talis, and this doesn't only mean a talis that we wear in shul. Talis is a reference to a beged that does not have four corners. Petura, it is exempt from tzitzits. So if you have a beged that has two corners, it doesn't need tzitzits. Three corners, it does not need tzitzits. You have to have four corners in order to have a chiyuv of tzitzits. Yesh la yoiser me arba. Let's say the beged has more than four corners. Chayeves, that beged is obligated in tzitzis. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Aleph. The Mechaber said, beged she'ein la, a beged that does not have four corners, is not chayev in tzitzis. Says the Mishnah Berurah she'ein la, points out the Chofetz Chaim, this is true, bein betchilas asiyasai, whether when you first manufactured and fashioned this garment, it didn't have four corners, so it was never a four-cornered garment. From the moment it was manufactured, it never had four corners. Ubein shechatach achakach knaf echad va'asahu agoil. Or the same halacha would apply. Here we have a nifty little four-cornered cloth that my wife made me over here. So let's say, if you notice, this beged has four corners. Well, it is three right now. One, two, and down here it's got a third corner. And then I rounded one of the corners down here. Where'd it go? Whoops. Down here, I rounded this corner to illustrate a case that we're going to see later on. But imagine if this originally had four corners, and then we went ahead and rounded this corner. So initially it was a four-cornered garment, and then by rounding off one corner, we made it so that now it only has three. Still in all, says the Chofetz Chaim, this is now a three-cornered garment. A three-cornered garment is not chayiv in tzitzits. And that's the kavanah of the Chofetz Chaim over here, that this halacha, that if you don't have four corners, if you only have three, you're not chayiv in tzitzis, is true, bein betchilas asiyasai, whether at the point of its original manufacture it didn't have four corners, ubein shechatach achakach knaf echad, or maybe it did have four corners, and you cut one off, va'asahu agoil, and you made that corner rounded. Now it no longer has four corners, so it is not chayiv in tzitzis. Ois Katan Beis, petura. If you have less than four corners, that beged is potter. It's exempt from a chiyuv of tzitzis. How do we know this? Says the Chofetz Chaim, mivur b'kra. This is actually very clear from the pasuk. Yes, I do have a chumash over here. This is very clear from the pasuk. Dvarim chaf beis yud beis. Chaf beis yud beis. The pasuk says, Gedilim tasalach, you should make gedilim, you should make fringes, which we know means tzitzis. Al arba kanfais kisusacha, on the four corners of your garment, asher techase ba, that you cover yourself with. Okay, says the Mishnah Berurah like this. The fact that you need a minimum of four corners, mivur bikra, this is spelled out in the pasuk, tiksiv, because the pasuk says, al arba kanfais kisusacha, on the four corners of your garment. V'darshinon b'sifri, and we have a brayso in the sifri that says, arba, when the Torah Kedosha says that you need four corners, that is exclusive. Four corners, v'loy shalosh, but not three corners. It's only a 4-cornered beged that's chayiv, not a 3-cornered beged. So you'll ask me a question. The Mechaber said, less than 4 corners, potter. More than 4 corners, chayiv. Wait a second. I thought 4 corners is exclusive. So maybe 4 corners, yes. 3 corners, no. 5 corners, no. Maybe it's only specifically a 4-cornered garment that's chayiv. How do we know that more than 4 corners is chayiv? So explains the Mishnah Berurah that we have sort of 2 conflicting implications in the pasuk. On the one hand, it says Gedilim tasalach al arba kanfris ksusacha, on 4, which looks like it's exclusive. 4, yes. Different than 4, no. On the other hand, continues the Mishnah Berurah here, the yoiser me arba, how do we know that more than 4 corners is chayiv? Marbinon me asher techase, because the pasuk gives us an exclusive term and an inclusive term. On the one hand, it says Gedilim tasalach al arba kanfres kisosacha, and that is exclusive. 4, yes. Something else, no. On the other hand, the pasuk says asher techaseba, the garment that you cover yourself with. Now, the implication of asher techaseba is any garment that you cover yourself with. That is an inclusive phrase. It sounds like any garment. So how do we reconcile the exclusive phrase and the inclusive phrase? The way we reconcile it is al arba, 4, yes. Less than 4, no. Asher techaseba comes to be marbe, it comes to include more than 4. So arba excludes less than 4. Asher techaseba includes more than 4. Says the Mishnah Berurah, ve'ipcha. Now let's say you want to say the exact opposite of what we just said. Maybe what we should say is like this. Arba means 4, yes. More than 4, no. Asher techaseba comes to include even less than 4. Even 1, 2, and 3. So we're taking the drasha and we're flipping it. Who says that Asher techaseba comes to be marbe more than 4 and arba comes to be mimayat less than 4? Maybe arba comes to be mimayat more than 4 and Asher techaseba comes to be marbe less than 4. Maybe we should flip it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you cannot do that. The ipcha, to flip the drasha, loy nucha loymar. You can't say that because it doesn't make any sense. Why? Shebechlal chamesh arba, because 5 includes 4. Ve'ein bechlal shalosh arba, but 3 does not include 4. What does the Mishnah Berurah mean? Very simple. If we learn the drasha like we're learning it, so we're saying like this: 4 is exclusive. 4, yes. Less than 4, no. Asher techaseba comes to include that anything more than 4, 5 corners, 6 corners, 7 corners, those are all chayiv and tzitzis. Explains the Chavetz Chaim, that makes sense. You know why? Because the pasuk says arba. Now, a 5-cornered garment has 4 corners. A 10-cornered garment has 4 corners. A 20-cornered garment has 4 corners. So to learn the drasha that way, to say that arba comes to exclude less than 4, well, a 3-cornered garment does not have 4 corners. So it makes sense to say that arba excludes less than 4, and asher techaseba comes to include more than 4, because even what we're including 5, 6, 7, etc., etc., those also fit into arba, because they all have 4 corners. If you want to flip the drasha, then you're saying like this: arba, 4, comes to exclude anything more than 4. Asher techaseba, that comes to include 1, 2, and 3. That doesn't make sense. How is 1 mekayim arba kanfos? 1 doesn't have 4. 2 doesn't have 4. 3 doesn't have 4. So therefore, the Chavetz Chaim says this is the only appropriate way that we can make the drasha. We cannot flip it. It doesn't make sense to flip it. Continues the Chavetz Chaim, Valav dafka balas chamesh, when the Mechaber says that a 5-cornered beged is chayiv. The Mechaber doesn't say that. The Mechaber says, Yesh lo yoise me arba chayeves. If you have more than 4, it's chayiv. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is just saying, V'lav dafka balas chamesh, when we talk about more than 4, it's not only 5, hu adin balas sheish v'sheva, any number that's more than 4, 6, 7, 9, 12, anything that's more than 4 would be the same, it would be chayiv. Ois cotton gimel, chayeves, so if you have more than 4 corners, it's chayiv and tzitzis. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this is not a davar muskim. Not everybody agrees with this. V'yesh poitrin. There are those that rule that a garment that has more than 4 corners is taka not chayiv and tzitzis. Now the truth is, what this is based on, it's always fascinating to me. The Mishnah Berurah in Ois Cotton Bays brought down the Sifri. The Sifri, you read the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Cotton Bays, it sounds like the Sifri says 4 yes, less than 4 no, more than 4 yes. Truth is, the Sifri doesn't say that. If you look at the Sifri says Arba comes to be Mimayit, Arba yes, 3 no. But the Sifri also says not 5 and not 6. So the Sifri, if you look at the Sifri does not say that Arba is a miut and Asher Techasaba is a riboy. The Sifri says that Arba is a miut. And the Sifri says that Arba comes to be Mamayit less than 4, and it also comes to be Mamayit more than 4. So you have over here in Ois Cotton Gimel, V'yesh Poitrin. Those that hold that more than 4 is Pater and Tzitzis, they base it on a very simple, vanilla reading of the Sifri. Now, happens to be that there's a Rush. The Rush says that that's not what the Sifri means. And the Rush brings a raya that the Sifri cannot mean that. Because there's a Beferish Gemara, I believe it's in Zvachim, there's a Beferish Gemara that says that more than 4 is chayiv. So the Rush says that when the Sifri says that 4 is coming to exclude less than 4 and also coming to exclude more than 4, he learns that that's not precisely what the Sifri means. What the Sifri means is 4 comes to be memayit that less than 4 is not chayiv tzitzis at all, and it also comes to be memayit that more than 4 corners is chayiv tzitzis, but you don't put tzitzis on every corner. You only put tzitzis on 4 of the corners. So a 7-cornered garment is chayiv tzitzis, but you only put the tzitzis on 4 of the corners. You don't put the tzitzis on 7 corners. So again, let's just recapture over here. The Mechaber said, what kind of beged is chayiv tzitzis? 4 corners. Less than 4 corners is pater. More than 4 corners is chayiv. Said the Mishnah Berurah, what's that based on? The Mishnah Berurah said, well, we have a pasuk. The pasuk says, Gedilim tasalach al arba kanfos. Arba is a miut. 4 yes, other numbers no. The pasuk continues, Asher techaseba. Asher techaseba is a blanket statement. Any kind of garment you cover yourself with. So that's a ribui. Says the Chavetz Chaim, what does this mean? What it means is, Arba, in order to be chayiv in tzitzis, you need 4 corners. Less than 4 corners is pater in tzitzis. That's the miut of Arba. 4 yes, less than 4 no. More than 4 is chayiv. We learn that out from the ribui of Asher Techaseba. Now here in Ois Cotton Gimel, the Mishnah Berurah says you should know it's not a davar muskim. There are some shittas that hold that more than 4 corners is taka pater in tzitzis. What is that based on? To me, it would seem to be based on a simple reading of the Sifri. But we have the Rush who says that that's not the proper understanding in the Sifri. The Rush says the proper understanding of the Sifri is that Arba Kanfos is mimayit less than 4. That a beged with less than 4 corners is completely pater in tzitzis. It's also mimayit that a beged with more than 4 corners, although it's chayiv in tzitzis, but you only put the tzitzis on 4 corners, not on more than 4 corners. In any case, let's go back to the Mishnah Berurah's Cotton Gimel. V'yesh poitrin. There are those that hold that a beged that has more than 4 corners is pater in tzitzis. Lachein, therefore, says the Chavetz Chaim, ein lasois pas chamesh lechatchila. Lechatchila, you should not make a garment with more than 4 corners. Don't make a 5-cornered garment because you're getting yourself involved in a suffix. You're getting yourself involved in a machlokes hapoiskim. Is it chayiv in tzitzis or is it not? Because of a Prima Godim, the Prima Godim writes that this is very, very negeya. Deladas hapoitrin, according to those shitas who hold that a beged that has more than 4 corners is not chayiv in tzitzis. So the Pri Megadim speaks about a situation that was apparently very common. If you take a look at this beged that I showed you before, disregard the rounded corner on the bottom over there. Imagine that that was a 4-cornered garment. Now you see the T that my wife so artistically cut in the middle? Imagine that that's the neck opening for the tzitzis. Let's say that this is a talus cotton, right? And that T is a neck opening, right? You could imagine you fold these down and you have a beautiful collar. So this is the neck opening. Now let me ask you a question. How many corners does this beged have? Remember, I said disregard the rounded corner. So at first glance, you would say it's a 4-cornered beged. Says the Pri Megadim, not really. Maybe it's a 6-cornered beged. Why? Because there's a corner here and there's a corner here. The interior corners of the T, those are also corners. So maybe this is a 6-cornered beged. And then, according to this shita that holds that a 6-cornered beged is not chayiv in tzitzis, such a beged would be a beged that you shouldn't wear because this would be a suffix. This would introduce us into this machloikis, is a 6-cornered beged chayiv or not. Says the Pri Megadim, no, you don't have to worry. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah inside. The cause of Pri Megadim, the Pri Megadim says, Deladas hapoitrin, according to the shitas that hold that a beged with more than 4 corners is potter, oisan talisais ketanim shalanu, those talus cottons that we have that are fashioned in this way, sheyesh beis hatzavar, they have that neck opening in the middle that's cut like a T. Mikamakim roiv sasam. We don't have to worry about it being considered a 6-cornered beged. Why? Because at the opening, you see the vertical. I'm so bad at this arts and craft stuff. I don't even know how to show it off properly on the camera. You'll bear with me. You see the vertical cut of the T. That vertical cut, if it's made so that it does not open the roiv, the majority of the beged, from the opening down to the bottom, okay, I didn't measure when this was cut, but as long as it does not go through roiv of this portion of the beged, from the neck opening down to the bottom, if it's closed the majority of the way, then we consider it closed and we don't recognize those corners as being corners. So see it inside, we come up a roiv sasam. As long as that vertical leg of the T does not open up roiv from the opening, from the horizontal opening of the T down to the bottom, we don't have to concern ourselves with those corners. Umiu im era sharoiv pasuach, if it would come out that most of it would be opened, then you would have a problem. Then it would be 6 corners. Then we would have to worry about those corners. So suggests the Pri Megadim, what should you do? Yase bekolnar sha'isa machayotim k'tas ogoil. Let me see if I could show you, if I could somehow figure out how to hold this. What he's saying is like this. Okay, here we have the T. So as long as the T, where is my trusty, I always keep a, here it is. I always have these little rulers handy. So if the vertical cut of the T is less than roiv from the horizontal cut down to the bottom, then says the Pri Megadim, we don't have to worry about it. Then it's considered closed, and we don't have to worry about these 2 corners over here. However, if it would be that the vertical cut would open up roiv of the beged over here, so then we would have to take one of these corners and cut it to round off this corner. In this case, we would have to actually round off both of them because this is 6 corners. We have to make it 4 corners. So we would have to round off both of those corners by cutting them so that we don't have this shaila of having more than 4 corners. Okay. Now let's go back to the Mechaber. So the Mechaber told us that in order to be chayiv, you have to have 4 corners. Less than 4 corners is potter. More than 4 corners is chayiv. Oh, So now the question is, if you have a beged that has more than 4 corners, where do you put the tzitzis? Continues the Mechaber, and the Mechaber says, top line near the end of the line, what do you do if you have more than 4 corners? Va'oisela arba tzitziyos, you put on 4 sets of tzitzis, not more. And where do you put them? Ba'arba kinafeha, on its 4 corners, hamaruchakais zu mizu yoiser, that are the furthest apart. So, for example, I took over here a piece of paper. Now, okay, how many corners does this beged have? This beged has 7 corners, right? You see the nice neat numbers that I made over there, and you see it has 7 corners. Now, you're only going to put tzitzits on 4 of the corners. Which 4 corners should you put the tzitzits on? Says the Mishnah Berurah, put them on the 4 corners that are the furthest apart one from the other. To me, therefore, it would seem we put 1 here, we put 1 by number 3 over here, we put 1 down here by number 5, and then we put another one here by number 7. Those are the 4 corners that are the furthest apart one from the other. What is this based on? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Dalid, Ba'arba. First point that the Chavetz Chaim makes is, the Mechaber says, how many sets of tzitzits do we put on a beged that has more than 4 corners? Only 4. You don't put on tzitzits on each corner of the multi-cornered garment. You only put on 4 sets of tzitzis. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'im asa chamesh, and if you actually went ahead and put on 5 sets of tzitzits, over mishum bal tosef, then you would be over on the Isser Lav of Bal Tosef, because the Torah Akdosha says, Gedilim tasalach al arba kanfeis ksuscha. The Torah Akdosha instructs us only to put tzitzits on 4 corners. If you put tzitzits on 5 corners, you're over on Bal Tosef. This is actually a very interesting shaila that we don't have time to go into. The Mishnah Berurah says, what happens if you affixed tzitzits to 5 corners? You had a 5-cornered garment, and you said to yourself, I remember by the Dirshu shir, we learned that if a garment has more than 5 corners, it's chayiv in tzitzits. I guess that means that I have to put tzitzits on each one of the corners. So you went ahead and you put tzitzits on 5 corners. Well, right now, if you wear that beged, you're over on Bal Tosef. Because instead of having tzitzits on 4 corners, you have tzitzits on 5 corners. So somebody comes over to you and says, that's no good. You got to take off one of them. So, all right. So now you go ahead and you cut off one of them. Says the Mishnah Berurah, if you cut the tzitzits off of one of the corners, keshera, it's now a kosher pair of tzitzits, no problem. You could wear it, and you're mekayim the mitzvah of tzitzits. You can make the bracha on it and everything else. Ach sheyisharu ha'arba kanfos hameruchakos b'tzitzits u'gedol kamei. As long as after you cut off one of the sets of tzitzits, you now have 4 sets of tzitzits on the 4 corners that are the furthest apart. Now, what I said is an interesting shaila is, when you read this Mishnah Berurah, it sounds like if you put 5 sets of tzitzits on this 5-cornered garment, and then you cut off one, it's kosher. Doesn't matter which one you cut off. Sounds like it doesn't matter. It sounds like you can cut off any one that you want. Whichever one you want to cut off, you cut off. The Mishnah Berurah says you should leave it so that you have tzitzits affixed to the 4 corners that are the furthest apart one from the other. But does it matter if the tzitzits that you cut off are one of the original 4, or it's the 5th? It sounds like it doesn't matter, right? Now that's interesting. I'll tell you why it's interesting. Because if you remember, when we learned Hilchos Sukkah, there's the concept of taseh v'lo min ha'asui. And we're going to see that by tzitzis, there's also a concept of taseh v'lo min ha'asui. By sukkah, in order for a sukkah to be kosher, it has to be taseh. It has to be that you made a sukkah, and when you put the schach on, it was kosher. If you put the schach on the sukkah, and you put the schach on the sukkah when the sukkah was puzzle, let's say the sukkah was inside a house, the sukkah was inside the garage, and you put the schach on the sukkah while it was inside the garage, and then you opened up the roof over the sukkah, that sukkah would be a problem, because it's taseh v'lo min ha'asui. You made the sukkah kosher after the sukkah was already built. So too over here, by tzitzis, there's also a concept of taseh v'lo min ha'asui. Now, if you go ahead and you put 5 sets of tzitzits on a 5-cornered beged, the 5th corner that you put on, was that corner were the tzitzits that were put on that corner, were they put on bekashrus? No, because when you put that fifth set of tzitzits on, that was puzzle. So when you put that set on, that set was not made bekashrus. Now, if you go cut off one of the other corners, you could potentially have a shaila of tasev aloim and asui. Because now you have 4 sets of tzitzits that are on the beged, but when they were put on the beged, they weren't put on bekashrus, because one of them was put on when the tzitzits were puzzle. So this is a very interesting shaila that the Mefarshim talk about. So I was ma'ur the shaila, but I didn't have time. I don't have time to really talk through it, but that's an interesting shaila that comes up over here. Okay, Ois Cotton Hay says to Mishnah Berurah, on a beged that has more than 4 corners, which of the 4 corners do you put the tzitzits on? So the Mechaber said on the 4 corners that are the furthest apart. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Cotton Hay, Hamaruchakos Yoiser. You put it on the corners that are the furthest apart. Why? Explains the Chavetz Chaim, Dimistaber, because it makes sense. Sheyesh lasos, that you should affix the tzitzits, ba'oisam shehem nikarim biyoser min hashar, on the corners that are the most nicker, and it's the most nicker if you space them out the most. Now, according to this, it would seem that the need to affix the tzitzits specifically to those corners is not a requirement min HaTorah. It's lechatchila. That's what you should do. Says the Mishnah Berurah. Now there's another shita. V'yeshayim. However, there are those that say, and this is an Eliyah Rabbah, v'yeshayim to whom midaraisa. There are those that say that no, this is actually a requirement midaraisa, and again it comes from the pasuk al arba kanfois kesusacha, and that means the 4 most prominent corners, which are the 4 corners that are the most spaced apart. And says the Mishnah Berurah, v'yesh lahachmir im efsher. If it's possible to be machmir, you should be machmir. What does it mean to be machmir? Well, it means, I guess, that if you don't have to wear a garment that has the 4 tzitzits on corners that are not the furthest apart, don't wear it. But if you already made this multi-cornered garment, this garment that has more than 4 corners, if you already put tzitzits on, and you didn't do it that way, you put it on corners that were closer together, and now you can't really fix it. Why can't you fix it? This is on your talis that you need for davening, and you got to daven right now. You have no time. It's man tefillah. You could be saimach on those who rule leniently, or levarech, and you could even make a bracha on such a talis. Okay, you can see already how complex and how fascinating these halachos are going to be. Now we go to Sif Beis. So just to recapture the critical points of Sif Aleph. In order to be chayiv in tzitzis, you need daled kanfas. Less than daled kanfas is potter. More than daled kanfas is chayiv. How many sets of tzitzits do you put on a garment that has more than 4 corners? Only 4 sets of tzitzits. Which corners do you put them on? You put them on the 4 corners that are spaced the furthest apart. Okay, now let's go to Sif Beis. Sif Beis, says the Mechaber. Yesh la arba. Let's say the garment had 4 corners. V'chatach echad ba'alachsoin, and now you cut one of the corners. So you had a 4-cornered beged, and okay, we'll grab a sheet of paper. So you had a 4-cornered beged, perfect 4-cornered beged. And then you cut the chatach echad ba'alachsoin va'asoi shnayim. And then you cut off one of the corners. Okay. You cut off one of the corners, and you made it into 2 corners. So now how many corners do you have? Now you have 5 corners. Says the Mechaber, yesh lo arba, it had 4 corners. V'chatach echad ba'alachsoin, and you cut off one of the corners at an angle, on a diagonal. V'asoi shnayim, so that you made another 2 corners. Harei nasis balas chamesh. So now it's a 5-cornered garment. And like we just saw in Sef Aleph, if it's a 5-cornered garment, v'chayeves. So it's chayiv in tzitzis. And how many tzitzis are you going to put on? You're going to put on 4 sets of tzitzis. Says the Mishnah Berurah, ois katan vav. Echad ba'alachsoin. You cut off one of the corners at an angle. Says the Mishnah Berurah, hu adin imchatach shtei kanfais ba'alachsoin. Or, let's say you went ahead and you didn't cut off, one corner at a diagonal. You cut off 2 corners at an angle. And now you have 6 corners. Nasas balashesh. So now it's a 6-cornered garment and you're chayiv. Ois katan zayin balas chamesh. You turned it into a 5-cornered garment. V'chein similarly. Imahayot tchila shalosh. Let's say it was a 3-cornered garment. Now don't get into me and ask me how this is a garment. I'm not going to get into that. But let's say you had a triangle. You had a 3-cornered garment. V'chatach knaf achas. V'chatach knaf achas lishnayim. And then you know what you did? You went ahead and you cut off one of the corners, right? You cut off one corner. I cut off the bottom corner over there. And now I made it a 4-cornered garment. Nases balas arba. Now it's a 4-cornered garment. V'chayeves petzitzis. And it is completely chayev in tzitzis. Okay. Now the Mishnah Berurah talks about a little of the complications of this case. V'tzarich shetia hakaticha gedola v'nikeres. The cut has to be gedola v'nikeres. It has to be that you cut off an amount down here that made it very clear that you cut off a piece and that there are now 2 corners. That comes la'afuke. Let's say what you did was you just did this. I don't even know if this is going to show up in the camera. But yeah, you could see it in the camera. If you could see, I'll put it against the backdrop of my robe over here so you can see. I cut off a tiny little piece and I made a straight line here at the corner. But is that gedola v'nikeres? Do you really see 2 corners over there? Not really. When do you see 2 corners? If I do this, right? Now, it's very recognizable. I cut off a significant piece of the beged, and now I have very clearly 4 corners. And what's brought down is that this distance over here, between one corner and another one, in order to be considered gedola v'nikeres, there should be a gap of shloisha gudlim, 3 thumb widths. 3 thumb widths of distance over here between one corner and another, which is approximately, depending on the poskim that you go according to with the shiurim, it's approximately 6 centimeters, which is why I actually wrote over there 6 centimeters. Okay. V'ayin b'prima gadim, we're continuing Mishnah Berurah's cutting Zayin 3 lines down into the wide lines near the beginning. V'ayin b'prima gadim, the Chavetz Chaim says, take a look at the prima gadim. Shakasav writes, the dafke in chotach miktsas habeged. When we're dealing with this triangle over here, and we're turning it into 4 corners, says the prima gadim, that's only if you actually cut off a piece of the beged. So in my case, I'm taking this piece. Now I'm folding it, but don't pay attention to that. And I cut off a piece of the beged. So like the words of the Mishnah Berurah over here, the davke im chatach miktas habeged, this only works to make it into a 4-cornered garment if you cut off some of the beged, ad shal yidei zeh, so that through this cutting, nira oisei amakim kishtei kardayim, now it very clearly looks like 2 corners. 1 corner here and 1 corner there. Aval, im loy chatach klum. Let's say you did not cut off anything at all. And instead what you did was, rak pigima basakin kara ba'akeren. All you did was, you took a knife, and let's say this is a knife, and you cut into the corner. So I took my knife here, and I cut up. I just cut a line up. From the corner, up into the beged, I cut a slit. If I did that, in loy chatach klum, if I didn't cut anything off, rak pigima b'sakin, I just made a slit with a knife, kara ba'akeren, I cut into the corner, ad shenechlak oisei hamakim l'shnayim, so that by doing so, what I did was, I slit over here, and by making a slit over here, what I did was I separated this and this, right? So now down here, it's actually two pieces. If I had a knife here, which is funny because I usually do, but punct now I do not, but I could probably make a slit. Not so easy. Yep, it worked. Well, not quite. If I made a slit, okay, so that now at the bottom you see it ripped unevenly. But imagine if that slit went straight down to here. So now this and this are separated. So technically there are two tips. Technically there are two corners. Says the Pri Megadim, no, that would not be effective. So again, if you go back to Ois Kat Yud Aleph for the Shar Tzion, no, not there, a little bit further. V'ayin b'Pri Megadim, take a look at the Pri Megadim, Shekasav writes, the dafke im chotach miktas me'abeged. This is only effective to make it four corners if I actually cut off a piece of the beged and I made a recognizable four corners. But if I didn't cut anything off, rak pegima besakin kara ba'akeren, all I did was cut a slit with a knife going from that third tip going up, so that I split the bottom tip into two, that does not make it a four-cornered beged, unless what I did was I cut so much, I slit so high that I opened up roiv of the beged. If I made a vertical slit so that I opened up roiv from the bottom to the top, I opened up the majority, in that case it would again be considered four corners. Okay, it'll come on b'sif zayin, like we're going to see later on in sif zayin. Okay. Now we go to sif gimel, 3 lines down in the mechaber. Says the mechaber, Kafal kainois talisai. Let's say you had a four-cornered garment, and you folded one of the corners, ukisharam, and you tied it up. Oi tefaram, or you sewed it up. V'doime ki'ilu kitzan, and it looks now as if you cut it off. Ve'ein lo kanfais, and it no longer has corners. Afal pikein loy niftara. That does not exempt the garment from a chiyuv of tzitzis. So again, let's go back to my trusty little four-cornered garment over here. Let's say I took one of the corners, and this really was opened into four corners. But what I did was I folded it up, and I stitched it in order to round it. So you could very easily look at this and say, no more four corners, now it's only got 3 corners. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Another case he gives is, let's say we took a corner and we tied it. So I go and I shmush it up and I take a string and I tie a string around it so that it's no longer a corner. Or maybe I even knot the corner itself. I knot the corner of the beged so that it's no longer a corner. But you see, you know what I didn't do? There goes the camera out of focus. You know what I didn't do? I didn't really alter the beged. I didn't cut it. All I did was, I did some stitching, and I rounded off a corner with stitching. Or, I took string, and I tied up a corner to round it off and make it no longer a corner. In those cases, says the Mechaber, that is not effective. And he fears ice at the end of Sif Gimel, loy niftera, afal pikein loy niftera. That does not make the garment exempt from tzitzis. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah Ois Kat Ches. Loy niftera, that beged is not exempt from tzitzits. Why not? So the Mishnah Berurah tells us a very interesting lumdus. He says, because if we really didn't want those corners to be there, lifsaik v'lishtiyeh. What we should have done was, we should have cut it and removed it. If we didn't want this garment to be a four-cornered garment anymore, what we should have done was cut off the corner. Take a scissor and round it off. Ella, since we didn't do that, and instead we just stitched it into a round corner, Vadai desoifer lahateres atfira. Halachically, we look at it as if we are certain that at some point you're going to take those stitches out and you're going to return it to being a four-cornered garment. Hilkach, therefore, nechshav, we view it, ki'ilu kvar hiter atfirais, as if you already opened up the stitches and it is a four-cornered garment, the chayeves b'tzitzis, and it's chayev tzitzis. So again, it's very important to truly understand what the Mishnah Berurah is saying over here. I went ahead and stitched up that rounded corner. But what I didn't do was I did not take a scissor and actually cut the fabric and round off the corner. I stitched it into a rounded corner. Therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, halachically, we look at it that means that I want to retain the corner. If I didn't want to retain the corner, I would have cut it, but I didn't cut it. Elamai, I want to retain the corner. Oh, that means that one day soon I'm going to take the stitches out and I'm going to return it to being a corner. Therefore, halachically, we still look at it as being a four-cornered garment and it needs tzitzits. Now, it's very important to understand the way the Mishnah Berurah said that. Let's see what the Mishnah Berurah says now. Umitam zeh, since that is the explanation, since the explanation of why this garment is still chayiv in tzitzis is because we consider that rounded corner to still be a squared off corner, because we assume that I'm going to open the stitches and return it to being a squared off corner, I could attach the tzitzits to that corner where it's rounded off, af lamata mikesher agudel, even if it's so close to the edge of the garment that it is less than a thumb's width away from the edge of the garment. If we would reopen it, it would be further than a thumb's width away from the edge of the garment. What does this mean? Tell you what it means. We are going to learn. Okay, let's do it this way. If you take a look, see, the problem is that, first of all, the camera is mirror image. Second of all, I have to figure out how to hold it and still show you what I'm doing. You see that mark that I made over there? Imagine that's the hole that the tzitzits are going to go into, and the tzitzits are going to hang from the beged at that hole. We're going to learn that that hole has to be placed in a specific location. It has to be not closer to the edge of the beged than one thumb's width, and not further away from the edge of the beged than three thumbs width. Now, I want you to imagine something. Let's imagine that where that blue dot is perfectly kosher for a place to make the hole, okay? Let's imagine that it is more than a thumb's width away from the edge, and it's less than three thumbs width away from the edge. So I put tzitzits in there, and that's where my tzitzits are. But now I came and I stitched up the corner of the beged, and I rounded it, like I did on this corner over here. Wrong corner. Again, it's that mirror image thing. This corner, I rounded off. Now, if the hole that I had made for the tzitzits was originally more than a thumb's width away from the edge, but now that I rolled it up and I stitched it, now that hole is going to be less than a thumb's breadth away from the edge. Is that a problem? Says the Mishnah Berurah, no, it's not a problem. You know why? Because remember, the lumdus of why this beged, even though it has a rounded corner, is chayiv in tzitzis, is because we view it as if this is opened. So if we view it as if it's opened, l'chumra, to make it a corner and make the beged chayiv in tzitzis, we also view it as if it's opened so that the hole where the tzitzits are going to go, even though now it's right at the edge, but if I would reopen it, it would be further away from the edge. And therefore, it's kosher. That's what the Mishnah Berurah means here. Let's read it again. The Mishnah Berurah says like this, Umitam zeh, based on this lumdus, yuchal lahatel ato hatzitzis pakefel, I can make the hole where I'm going to put the tzitzits through the beged, I can make it inside the area that's folded up and stitched, Af lamata mikesher agudel, even if it's less than a thumb's width away from the edge of the beged. That's true if kishe when I reopen the corner and extend the fabric, if the hole would be more than a thumb's width off of the edge when the corner is re-extended and reopened, then it's kosher even if now when it is folded up, it's less than a thumb's width away from the corner. V'chol however, says the Chavetz Chaim, this is true b'shekefaloi utfaroi beigel. This is true if what you did was what I did on this beged over here, where I folded it up and I sewed it so that I rounded off the corner. That's when this is true. Aval, im kafal v'tafar biribua. Let's say all I did was I took my four-cornered beged, okay? Here's my four-cornered beged, and instead of cutting off a corner and rounding it, all I did was I took the entire bottom of the beged, right? The entire length of the beged, and I folded it up and I stitched it. I made a hem. It was this long. I wanted it to be shorter, so I did that. Now it's still four corners. I did it b'ribua. I squared it the same way it was squared before. Says Mishnah Berurah like this: if that's what I did, if I folded it up and I stitched it so that I kept the bottom of the beged still square, in this case, I didn't take off any corners. It was a four-cornered beged. It still is a four-cornered beged. I stitched it up so that it continues to have four corners. Das halavush v'hamagen Avram. In that case, it's the opinion of the Lavush and the Magen Avram. Derashoy lahatul sham tzitzis bakefel afal pi shehu yoiser misholosh etzbois misfas hakeren. Oh, what he's saying is like this. Let's say I went ahead and I folded it up. Okay, I'm going to make the fold. Okay, I made the fold. Okay, now I go ahead and I make a hole and I put tzitzits right over here. Now, wait a second. We had just said earlier in this ice cotton that when you fold something and you make stitches, we view it as if it's opened, right? We said if you fold up a corner and you round it off and you stitch it closed, we view it halachically as if it's opened. Okay, in this case, I folded it up and I stitched it. And now I put the tzitzits over here. And the hole that I made for the tzitzits are in a perfect location. It's 1 thumb's width away from the edge, and it's less than 3 thumbs widths away from the edge. But if I open it, now suddenly I extended the garment. Now if I extended the garment, my hole that's up here is more than 3 thumbs width away from the edge. Now, according to the lumdus that we've been saying in this ice cotton, that pair of tzitzis should be puzzle. Why? Because even though I folded it up and I stitched it, we say that halachically we look at it as if it's opened. Well, if it's opened, then the hole that I made for the tzitzits is more than 3 thumbs width away from the edge. So it should be puzzle. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. The Lavush and the Mardechai say that would be kosher. Why? And he says like this. Kevan de tfara shari. Since you stitched it up, it's okay. What's the lumdus of the Lavush and the Mardechai? Apparently, what the Lavush and the Mardechai say is that this lumdus, that if you fold up a corner and stitch it, we look at it as if it's still opened. That's only if you took away a corner. But in this case, you didn't take away a corner. In this case, you modified the beged by shortening it, but you didn't take away a beged, and it still has 4 corners. So we recognize the corners that are there. However, V'Rabbim Cholkin al Zeh, many disagree with this shita. Usfirlu, when they hold the Gambazeloi Mani Tvira, that even in this case we don't recognize the stitching. V'Shani Hahi de Sivav, and we'll get to Sivav. The Mayri Shekaf Lakula V'Chein Derech Malbush, and that's why the stitching is not recognized. Masha Einkein Bazeh Shaloi Kafal Rak Mitzvah Sabeged. I'm not going to go into the details of the last two lines over there. Maybe I'll explain it at the outset of tomorrow's shir. We're going to stop over here by Sif Dalit. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The discussion of limud HaTorah should be made against Klal Yisrael. For Baruch Hashem should say Yeshua Sefuas Parnasa and Shu'uduchim to all those in need. And we should be zeichet to see the Bias Goyel Tzedek B'Mehera V'Yameinu Amen. Be well.